This is Congress, and the material I'm talking on in this and the next module is actually for last week, for April 12th to 16th. I'll be talking about, in the first module, chapters 8 and 9 of Davidson and Oleszek and Lee and Schickler, about the internal business of Congress, how Congress does things internally as a legislative body. And I'll be more specific about that in a minute. And then in the second module for this week, we'll start discussing the Baker book on House and Senate. And that's also the reading for this week, for the 19th to the 23rd. So I'll probably do 3 lectures on the Baker book, an introductory lecture for the material for this last week, and then we'll probably do 2 more lectures on that, and then that will carry us through, again, the end of this week and the beginning of next week. So let me remind you where we are. We're now discussing the other Congress of the 2 Congresses that Davidson and Oleszek talk about, the representative body and institution, and then the legislative body and how it performs these 2 functions. And we have looked at the internal structures of Congress, the party system that also provides leadership and organization for the chambers, and the committee system, which divides the business up of Congress. It's where the real legislative work of Congress takes place. And also, by the way, the staff, the role of staff, and including Malbin's very interesting argument that a good deal of the internal business of the legislative business in terms of drafting legislation and negotiation of legislation is performed by staff now. In these 2 chapters, 8 and 9, we're really talking now about how the structures operate. Remember, at the beginning of the course, I said that there were 5 components of an institution: a power or function, a structure, a set of procedures, a history, and a personality. And so in these 2 chapters, we're really talking about the procedures by which Congress works internally as an institution. And also, by the way, the material that in chapter 8 and 9 you'll see in some ways is also reverberated throughout the Baker book, because chapter 8 and 9, especially chapter 8, which is on rules, more about that in a minute, is about both the House and the Senate rules, because, of course, when we're talking about the Congress as a legislative institution, it consists of 2 chambers, 2 completely independent chambers of equal legislative authority. Although, by the way, just to remind you of this, let me pause and talk about this a bit. When I say 2 equal legislative chambers, not every bicameral legislature are the 2 bodies of equal constitutional power, of legislative weight or power. For instance, up until 1911, the British Parliament, which consists of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, did, in fact, both chambers had equal legislative weight, which is to say, how do you measure that? It means that laws can't pass without the agreement of both. And if that's the case, then both chambers have equal constitutional authority, even if they have specifically different tasks. We'll come back to that in a minute with the House and Senate. So, in 1911, there was a constitutional reform. Remember, by the way, that since Britain has an unwritten constitution, that you don't have to pass constitutional amendments to change the Constitution. All you have to do is pass an act of Parliament. And the House of Lords, which is, again, non-elective, it's the upper chamber consists of the hereditary aristocracy, plus the leading bishops and archbishops of the Church of England, and plus other honorary individuals of titles created by the Crown. In 1911, the issue, by the way, facing British politics was the rise of the welfare state, and the House of Lords was resisting a good deal of economic legislation and welfare legislation. And in 1911, Parliament passed a law which reduced the legislative authority of the House of Lords, in this sense that a bill passed by the House of Commons then just goes to the House of Lords. It can originate in the House of Lords too, by the way. But if the House of Lords rejects the legislation passed by the House of Commons, the House of Commons can re-vote on it and it becomes law anyway. Clearly, that shift in the British Constitution meant that the House of Lords is no longer an equal legislative body. It becomes something of a check upon or an advisory body for the House of Commons. But in the U.S. Constitution, the House and the Senate are of equal legislative authority, and they operate independently. Article 1, Section 7 tells how a bill becomes a law, and we'll discuss some of those aspects in Chapter 8, the formal rules of either chamber. And again, just to point out, the Constitution does assign specific responsibilities to both chambers. For instance, Article 1, Section 9 says that all bills raising revenue, all revenue bills, tax bills, have to originate in the House, although the Senate can amend, etc. We've seen two dramatic impeachments in the last couple of years, and you know that the House, the Constitution assigns the impeachment process itself, which is the accusation stage or the indictment stage of the impeachment process, and then assigns the trial to the Senate. And you also know from Article 2, Section 2, that the Senate has a special responsibility when it comes to confirming executive appointments to the executive branch and to the judicial branch, and also that the Senate has to ratify treaties. So aside from those specific differences in function, the two chambers are of equal legislative power, because legislation has to pass both chambers. And of course, the president shares some of that legislative power because he signs legislation. Of course, that can be overridden with the overriding of a veto with the 2/3 vote. So what we're doing in these two chapters, after seeing the internal structures of Congress that help it to embody and perform its legislative function, its lawmaking function, now we're turning to the procedures now and the way the chamber actually works on the inside. Let me distinguish between the material in these two chapters, even though they both have to do with how individuals behave and how the chamber behaves. Chapter 8 is on rules. Now, this is pretty descriptive stuff in the text. It's not exciting material. It's a description of the rules. And I have to say that the internal business of a legislative chamber in some ways is unlike the internal business of any other institution. All institutions, to go back to the 5 parts of an institution that I mentioned at the beginning of the course, all institutions have powers, functions, structures, procedures, etc., history, and personality. But a legislative chamber isn't just a group of people that sit around and talk and vote. Probably, and this is true of all the legislatures of the world, legislatures have remarkably precise and often arcane and mysterious to the outside complex rules of procedure. And by the way, if you've ever been in a club or an organization or a body that functioned as a legislature, then you may be used to parliamentary procedure, which is very complex. And by the way, when I served on the Senate for several terms at Converse College, the faculty Senate, before the institution realized what a mistake that was, I was its parliamentarian, and therefore I had to become an expert on Robert's Rules of Order, parliamentary procedure. And the reason that legislatures tend to have these complex internal rules is so as to guarantee, one, that the internal process of legislation doesn't become a mob phenomenon. Generally speaking, the internal procedure of legislative bodies is a majoritarian process. And after we go through the Baker book on the House and Senate and the differences between the House and the Senate in terms of their rules, etc., we'll talk a little bit about that in Chapter 8. And Chapter 8 begins that discussion. Baker continues it further in comparing the two chambers. And of course, as I've already suggested from the beginning of the course, we'll also turn to a very hot topic right now with respect to Congress, and that is the filibuster, for reasons we'll talk about when we discuss that material. And so the reason that legislative chambers have these internal complex rules is to guarantee procedure, to make sure that every concerned voice has an opportunity to be heard, to make sure that that the internal business is procedural and fair, and generally speaking, according to the wishes of the majority. And you'll see, by the way, we've already seen this from the first chapter of the Baker book, which we read earlier, but I'll go back and talk about it in the next lecture. It's clear the Senate and the House, they both have their rules, and so let's begin with some of the descriptions and generalizations about these two chambers and their rules. It's a surface observation that that both chambers have rules, but the House is more rule bound than the Senate. So you're going to see this is an observation that Baker picks up. We've already seen this to some degree in the Davidson and Oleszek with respect to chapter 6 and 7. And the reason, so why is that? Why is it? Let me expand that a bit. So the House is both a much more structured body. Its rules are much more control the individual behavior and floor behavior especially, and committee behavior of the members much more than the Senate does. The Senate is more informal. It has rules, but as you're going to see, those rules are tempered by a kind of collegiality, at least up till they have been historically, and formality in the Senate. Just as both chambers have parties and committees, but the way that parties, committees, and staff, by the way, and Baker, as you're going to see, will pick up the comparison about how members of the House and Senate relate to their staff members, kind of taking forward some of Melvin's observations and putting them in a bicameral context. Why this difference then? Why is the House more structured, more rule bound? Why are members much more limited in terms of floor actions, voting, amendments, and committees than the Senate, which tends to give much more power to individual members of the Senate? And in fact, by the way, one could say that the United States Senate is probably the most individualistic legislative body on earth. And you'll see that what that means is the Senate gives more power to individual senators in terms of the legislative process and the internal business of each of the Senate than almost any other legislative chamber on earth gives to its members. And so why are the basic reasons for that? And as we've seen from the beginning of the course, there are certain things that a constitution designer can manipulate, other things, and of the 5 parts of an institution. That's why the last 2, history and personality, are listed last, because those are the 2 aspects of the 5 parts of a legislation, of an institution, that the constitution designer can't control. So what kind of things can you control in a constitution? And the main determinant, of course, there are 3. Size, term, and mode of election. Also qualifications too, by the way. Let's be clear about that. And as long as we're talking about that, let's generalize. And you're going to see that in many of the aspects, the internal aspects of these 2 chambers, it's size that is the primary influence on the internal nature of the House and Senate. let's talk about that right now. The House, from the very beginning, before the population of the United States was ascertained in the first census, which then, of course, occurs every 10 years after that, the House's size was originally set at 65 arbitrarily. They kind of guessed based on an assessment of wealth and population. And then, of course, the Senate, which assigns 2 senators per state, had 26 members. And very quickly, of course, as the population of the United States expanded and grew, the size of the House grew considerably faster than the Senate. Of course, as the population grew and the size of the country grew and the number of states grew, the Senate also expanded. But basically, you could say that throughout most of the history of the House and Senate, the House has been 4 times larger, as it is now, with 435 members. The original rule for assigning the number of representatives that a state would get is at least 1 for every 30,000. By the way, for your information, just a little bit of history. This was the only time in the entire 4 months of the Constitutional Convention when George Washington, who was the president of the convention, and usually sat there in awesome, stony, and austere silence. This is the only time when he actually yielded the chair of the presidency and came to the floor and offered a provision, an amendment in the constitutional debates on September 16th, the day before the last day of the convention, when the Constitution was adopted and signed, and was the last day of the convention, September 17th, which is why we celebrate September 17th as Constitution Day. George Washington stepped down the presidency, and originally the rule of representation was at least 1 for every 40,000, but in order to make the Constitution more acceptable to the people and to give it a more democratic tinge, especially the House, he suggested that it be lowered to 1 every 30,000, at least 1 representative for every 30,000. And that was adopted unanimously by the convention, and then he resumed the presidency, and then the rest is history. So the House followed that rule up until about the beginning of the 20th century, when the growth of population was so great that they put a limit on the number with 435. And we already talked about that in chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the Davidson and Oleszek about apportionment and all those kinds of things. So the Senate, which has 100 members, so size is the explanatory determinative factor for many of the differences, even in terms of rule boundness and the nature of the rules, as you'll see, or formality and informality. As we've already seen with Chapter 6 in parties and leadership, that formality and informality, which you'll see reflected in the nature of the House and Senate rules, also extends to the amount of to the organization of the chambers in terms of the power of leadership and the relative strength of parties. The House is a more partisan body, it's a more hierarchical body, it's a more structured body, and as we'll see, as I already mentioned, it's a more rule-bound body. And so to go back to the things that can be manipulated in a constitution, size is one of them. Term. Clearly, members of the House, which are elected for 2 terms, and members of the Senate are elected for 6 terms. For 6-year terms. And by the way, you should also be aware of that in Article 1, Section 3, not only, here's another big difference between the House, and this often has portentous electoral consequences, but it also has an effect on the internal dynamics of each chamber. The House stands for election all at once. All 435 members, all the way from the Speaker to the most freshman member, stand for election every 2 years. And as we discussed with the rise of incumbency, and Baker will also come back to that a little bit, the turnover in the House was pretty significant up until the 1900s. The 20th century. Up until 1900, roughly half of the membership of the House changed every 2 years, which is a pretty fluid body. And then for reasons that we talked about when we talked about incumbency and representation, the rate of incumbency began to increase. So now that basically it's between 92 and 98%, depending on the election. Sometimes there are what are called wave elections, when there is more, like for instance in 2018, 40 members, New Democrats were elected, which then tipped the House to the Democratic Party. Although the Democrats lost a good number of seats in the 2020 election, so that now the partisan balance is, and both houses, by the way, is really 50-50. It's exactly 50-50 in the Senate. I think now there are the Democrats have a 2 to 4 vote majority now in the House. So it's both chambers are nearly 50-50 at this point in our history. So by the way, to finish the point about term and also mode of election in a second, so the House stands for election, and it's a more stable body now because of incumbency, but only a third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years, because the Constitution for the first 2 Senates divided the Senate into thirds, where 1/3 would have a 2-year term, another third would have a 4-year term, and then the other third would have a 6-year term. And then, of course, all senators now, after the first 2, then 4, then 6 years of the Constitution coming into effect in 1789, then all senators have a 6-year term. But the point is that their terms are staggered, so the body is more continuous. Now, what does that contribute to the internal character of each chamber? There is a certain sense in which the smaller number of the Senate, that size, plus it's somewhat more staggered and stable body, and because of the fact that they're there longer, at least in terms of a single term, and the fact that they are more nationally known characters, we talked about that too. And then I'd have to say mode of election. Remember that the House has been directly elected by the people of the United States ever since the beginning of the Constitution, but senators were elected by the state legislatures as reflective of the confederal elements of the old Confederation, and that the idea that the states are represented. Well, the states are still represented in the Senate because of the equality of representation of each state, but the 17th Amendment, of course, made senators now directly elected. So that's somewhat, as we saw when we talked in Chapter 2 about the historical development of Congress, somewhat suppressed those differences. Nevertheless, the size and term, and qualifications, by the way, as long as I'm talking about what you can manipulate in the Constitution, there are differences in qualification too. Remember, a member of the House has to be at least 25 years old, has to be at least a citizen 7 years, and live in the state that the representative represents. A senator has to be at least 30 years old, be a citizen 9 years old, and live in the state that a senator represents. Now, of course, those are one might say, differences of degree rather than kind. The change in the 17th Amendment probably suppressed some difference in the kind of individuals that ran for either chamber, because after all, I mean, the members of the House, popularly elected on the district level, tended to be more local individuals and less prominent, and members of the Senate elected by the state legislature tend to be more state figures, more prominent, more public figures. That's, again, since all members of Congress now have to run for a popular election, that's somewhat suppressed. So really, size and term are the primary constitutional determinants of the internal differences of these chambers. That explain why, for instance, the members of the House, unless they're there for many years, generally don't get to know each other unless they serve on the same committee. Because remember, from Chapter 7, members of the House only serve on one committee, and members of the Senate tend to serve on 2 to 3 committees. So in the House, that partially explains why it's a more rule-bound, more formal body, more partisan, and more hierarchical, because members of the House tend to be strangers to each other. Don't forget, by the way, and the calendars, which are discussed in Chapter 8, the scheduling of the internal business of each chamber, and there are different kinds of calendars. I'm not going to go over all of those. But basically, Congress is in session from Monday to Friday, and typically, really, from Tuesday to Thursday, because both members of the House and Senate like to go home. So when you add to the fact that they spend, especially members of the House, spend a good deal of time in their districts, unless they're there for many years or in positions of leadership, or on, you're talking about your specific committee, they remain strangers to each other. Senators, because there are fewer of them, because they're there, at least their terms are longer and they're staggered, and they serve on more than one committee, are that's the primary determinant in terms of the effect on its formality versus informality or its collegiality. Now, it's true that as our two parties have become more partisan and polarized in the last 30 to 40 years, that has had a sharp effect on there's probably less bipartisanship. And in fact, in Chapter 9 on decision making, when they talk about different cues and elements of what affects members of Congress' decision, we'll talk about several of those factors. The Senate, too, has become a more partisan body, but there's no question that it's modified by the fact that senators tend to know each other as colleagues, as equals, and therefore that personal dimension does have an effect on the bodies. And therefore legislation is processed quite differently. So when we come back later in the course to the hot topic of the abolition of the filibuster or the maintenance of the filibuster, something like the filibuster could never exist in the House of Representatives or in most legislative chambers. And it's this informality of the Senate and its willingness to treat members of the Senate as colleagues, as equal colleagues, that explains the remarkable power that the filibuster and the rules and the procedures in general give to individual senators and minority members of that chamber. Let me distinguish between the kind of material in Chapter 8 and 9, because, again, they both have to do with how each body works internally. But Chapter 8, which is pretty straightforward and not terribly exciting and is somewhat prosaic and descriptive and detailed about the rules, is, how can I put this without sounding brilliant? Chapter 8, it would be as if you walked in and read the manuals of each house. And Davidson and Olzek have done that for you, thank goodness. And what they've digested into one chapter is a pretty clean and but detailed body of the actual rules of each chamber. Though, in other words, it's the description of the actual rules of the, and anyone could do that, by the way. That is to say, if you wanted to spend a good portion of your life, you can go online. Remember, all this stuff's online now. And let me just say that one thing that you might want to, in terms of further research, or if you're interested in an internship, or the graduate students for this class, the appendices, in Davidson and Olzek and the notes are actually remarkably fecund sources of information and references. In information. So, by the way, you can read the rules. So, again, what Chapter 8 done is summarize those for you. They are a description of the actual procedures and rules of each chamber. Chapter 9 is a political science-y chapter, which is to say it uses political science research and modes of classifying and analyzing human behavior in political context to explain and describe how members of the House and Senate act and make their decisions. So it has a kind of a more psychological, if you will, or political sciencey character, and therefore it's more of an analysis of the way that members of the House and Senate behave, rather than a description of their formal rules. Although, again, both chambers essentially are a description of how each chamber functions, one through the formal rules and the other one through the strategies, modes of decision, and different determinants on behavior and decision making. Again, Chapter 9 was written by political scientists, and it was written by political scientists, the 4 political scientists who wrote this book. But they're speaking as political scientists, trying to make the behavior of members of the legislature and their internal behavior and their way of making their decisions intelligible to non-legislators. So with that in mind, let me just hit a couple of the highlights of Chapter 8 that you should pay specific attention to, either through the PRQs or this will be on the exam. First, you should note that the different types of procedures and legislation and the different types of bills. There is, for different purposes. Most of what Congress acts on are bills, and Article 1, Section 7 determines the procedure, how a bill becomes a law. I'm just a bill from Schoolhouse Rock or whatever that was. And there are also joint resolutions, concurrent resolutions, and simple resolutions. Part of that, the different kinds of actions have to do with the constitutional powers and functions. Like, for instance, Article 1, Section 4 gives each house the power to determine the elections and its rules. Article 1, Section 5, it's like keeping a record, the congressional record, and also punishing members, and also different kinds of internal business, and therefore these different kinds of bills and resolutions have to do with what kind of congressional function you're talking about. So, for instance, in terms of the internal business of each chamber, or the sense of a chamber, or for instance, let me give you an issue ripped out of today's headlines, since it is Monday, April 19th. You know that the jury verdict in the George Floyd Derek Chauvin case is the trial's going to jury, and Maxine Waters, who's an African-American congresswoman from California, went and made some controversial statements on the street in Minneapolis, and Kevin McCarthy, who's the Republican minority leader of the House, is going to be offering a measure of censure for her. Now, I'm not taking a position on the issues. I'm just pointing out that when it comes to censuring or reprimanding or expelling a member for punitive or punishments, those are done through simple resolutions, because obviously it has to do with the internal business of each chamber. So that's what a simple resolution is. A concurrent resolution is passed by both chambers that typically doesn't require the signature of the president. All bills that eventually become laws, of course, by Article 1, Section 7, not only require the agreement of both houses and the internal processes of both houses for legislation again, and also other kinds of resolutions, but also require the signature of the president. In fact, the Constitution says that every resolution that requires the agreement, with certain exceptions, does require the signature of the president. Constitutional amendments can originate in either house, but are done in the form of a joint resolution, which the president, interestingly enough, doesn't sign. The president doesn't have a formal role in constitutional amendments. So look at that discussion of the different kinds of actions: bills, joint resolutions, concurrent resolutions, and simple resolutions. Note there are procedural differences between the way that bills are submitted in the House and Senate. The internal procedures for legislation are roughly parallel, because of course the committee structure is parallel and the structure of party leadership is some. But the main difference in this respect is the relative power of the leadership, and especially in the House because of the unique function of the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee, and there's a very fine description of the function of the Rules Committee and the function of the Speaker. The Speaker has much more power over the internal business of the House than the Majority Leader. Now, again, remember that one big difference between the House and the Senate that you saw in Chapter 6 is that the party leadership of the House is the constitutional leadership of the House, whereas in the Senate, the constitutional leadership, the Vice President and the President pro tem, are the constitutional leadership, but they're not the party leadership. The majority and minority leaders are the true leaders of the House and Senate. But in some ways, the Speaker again and the Rules Committee. Now, one you might want to coordinate the material in Chapter 6 with the waxing and waning power of the Speaker over the history of the House, and connect it with the power that the Speaker has over the business of the House because of the unique authority over rules in the Rules Committee. And you'll see. Let me just summarize one big difference. All floor business, all bills, all resolutions that are that the House works on, the Rules Committee is that committee, and there's nothing like the Rules Committee in the Senate. We'll see that in a minute. But the Rules Committee is the body that determines how all legislation is processed and with what kinds of rules, which is why it's called the Rules Committee. Whether amendments will be allowed and how much time. And on that question, by the way, typically most legislation, when it's discussed in the House, each member typically is awarded by the rules about 5 minutes of floor time. Now, it's true that members of the House yield their floor time to each other all the time, and that means that you can increase the amount of floor time that a member of the House might have on a particular bill. But that's an example, by the way, of the big differences between the House and the Senate, because in effect, a senator, as long as I'm summarizing a little bit of that, the Rules Committee, again, is the body in the House that completely determines the formality of how legislation is discussed, voted on, amended, and passed, including what I was just mentioning, the amount of time each member gets to speak, or whether amendments are going to be allowed, etc. In the Senate, again, you're going to see that what substitutes for the function of the Rules Committee is not only the negotiation of the party leadership, but what are called unanimous consent agreements, where the leader of each party in the Senate, the majority and the minority leader, has the implicit consent of all the members of the caucus or conference to negotiate how bills are raised and everything. And that is a big difference between the House and the Senate. And in that respect, typically senators are allowed, for instance, not only to it depends, the unanimous consent. And the unanimous consent refers to the fact that there's the implicit agreement of every member of the Senate on these things that are negotiated. So what the Rules Committee does in the House, the unanimous consent leaders negotiated through the party leadership of the House and of the Senate are what takes its place. And again, when you're comparing the two bodies, senators generally can speak as long as they want, unless they're shut down by a closure vote. And we'll defer more of that when we talk about these things in the Baker book, and also in the Dove and Ehrenberg and Dove book on the filibuster, how that works. But typically senators can offer amendments, and even non-germane, non-relevant amendments. Nothing like that in the House. The House is much more, as I said, structured and formal, and the Rules Committee has complete authority over the way bills are discussed, which also then augments the authority, as we saw in Chapter 6, of the formal party leadership of the House. Look at the discussion of the different calendars. Each chamber has ways of scheduling its business. In the House, the union calendar, the private bill calendar, and look, I'm not going to go fully into this, although it's interesting, the distinction between public laws and private laws. Public laws are laws that affect the business of the nation. Private laws are also passed as legislation, but they typically affect the private status or interest within allowable legislation of individuals, which is why they're called private bills. Like, for instance, the Congress can grant citizenship to individuals besides the normal procedures for naturalization under the State Department. So those are called private bills. There's a corrections calendar, and again, those different kinds of calendars, which are all operating on different days and some parallel to each other, are controlled by the Rules Committee. The major difference in that respect between the House and the Senate is, don't forget, because of the constitutional responsibilities of ratifying appointments and treaties, there's an executive calendar in the Senate when appointments and treaties are pending in front of the body. look at the ways that bills are referred to committees and the different kinds of referrals, joint referrals, multiple referrals, and that's often an important piece of legislation and again, the Speaker has a good deal of authority in that respect in the House, as does the Rules Committee, in terms of assigning bills to different committees. And again, that's done through majority-minority negotiation and unanimous consent in the Senate. Pay attention to the meaning and role of discharge petitions, of how bills are dislodged from committee members, because even within a party there might be difference of opinion, and there might be difference of approach to legislation of members of a committee and the larger members of that party in the chamber. So discharge petitions are a way of moving legislation out of committee, and there's a nice straightforward discussion of that. One interesting thing you should look at is the discussion of omnibus and mega bills. This has been a change in the contemporary Congress in the last 30, 40, 50 years. And this will connect with part of the discussion in Chapter 9, especially on the question of queues, and something that I mentioned when we were talking about the staff and the committee system, that most members of, certainly the House, tend to be unfamiliar with the content unless it's very prominent and controversial and national attention. Because, again, since House members specialize on one committee, they know their own committee business very well, and the legislation on committee. But it's very rare for a member of Congress to read the legislation that they're actually voting on, which tends to shock or astound citizens. So, as you'll see, much of the discussion about modes of decision and decision-making and queues and log-rolling and bargaining in Chapter 9 have to do with what affects what affects how members decide and vote on things. And since they don't read the legislation, because nobody has time to do that, and they also have staff members to do that, you'll see that the critical thing is in terms of decision-making and voting or not voting for certain things, members are guided by substitutes for direct knowledge of the legislation they're voting on, and whether that's good or bad, you can make up your mind yourself. But we'll talk about that more in Chapter 9 in a bit. But one tendency of the Congress, for better or worse, is, and that's partially because of the clumsiness of the internal procedures in each body, is to pack together big chunks of legislation into huge omnibus. Omnibus literally means carrying all things. And some of the controversial legislation of the Biden administration, the COVID relief plan that was passed by the Congress, on reconciliation, we're going to talk more about that when we come to certain procedural things in the budget later on. In the Senate, because it clearly would have been filibustered by. So we'll talk the whole thing about what the process of reconciliation is in the budget process, which is dealt with in a subsequent chapter at Davidson and Olizek. But also the infrastructure bill that the president is proposing and is undergoing negotiation. Those are all omnibus bills in that they cover thousands of pages. And so, as Davidson and Olizek point out, there's a growing tendency in the Congress to pass legislation like that. And there are different political reasons for that, to put political pressure on people to vote a certain way, and including the president, by the way. Some observers consider that problematic, that it makes the process of legislation even more jumbled and less coherent, less intelligible. Nevertheless, that is a tendency of the evolving Congress. Again, in terms of comparing the House and Senate, look at the discussion in Chapter 8 of unanimous consent agreements and different procedures, holds, filibuster, and closure. Filibuster and closure we'll talk more about, again, because of the Davidson, because of the Baker book, and when we come to the question of filibusters and closure in the Aaron Berg and Dove book. So let me just briefly talk about Chapter 9. Types of decisions. Look at the different kinds of actions that members of either chamber can make. Different kinds of decision in terms of specialization, and part of this has to do with explaining how members of either the House or the Senate plan their careers, their legislative careers, in either chamber, and the nice discussion of timing, early deciders, active players, late deciders. Partially that has to do with a type of legislation, its content, oftentimes the part of the country a member of the Congress comes from, and look at the discussion of in terms of different actions and decision making of the discussion of sponsoring and co-sponsoring legislation, which is often an important way that a member of either chamber registers support for something without necessarily participating in its drafting. And also the decision to intervene with amendments, etc. There's an interesting discussion of different motivations for that. You would think, and look also in Chapter 9 of the discussion of casting votes. Now, it would seem to the citizen or the outsider that casting votes means the same thing. It means if you vote for something, you're supporting it. If you vote against it, you're opposed to it. But it turns out that there are different kinds of votes. Like there are procedural votes on legislation in addition to the final vote and substantive votes. And sometimes you may vote for something on one stage of a bill and against it on another stage. So a vote doesn't necessarily, for or against a resolution or a bill, doesn't necessarily mean your support for it. It depends on the stage of the bill, the issue involved, and you'll in that nice discussion, there are different motivations for why you're voting for and against things. This is often connected again with the way that challengers in local elections try to hold members of Congress responsible for is their record of voting. But again, votes can mean different things depending upon the stage of legislation, the content, as I said earlier. And then from Chapter 9, the last thing I want to talk about is, again, towards the end of the chapter, there's this discussion of different kinds of legislative bargaining, logrolling, where it's not so much that you vote in favor of something or against something or because of your ideology or your party, but rather because you're trading favors. And logrolling means literally, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. I'll vote for your tax increase if you vote for my tariff bill or something like that. It's trading individual favors. And Madison in Federalist 10 probably thought that a good deal of legislative business would be that kind of horse trading or logrolling. The last major topic I want to talk about are the determinants of voting, and especially the concept of queues. If you look at the determinants of voting, party is the most reliable determinant of how members of Congress vote, just as it is with citizens, by the way, that party is the most reliable cue that determines how citizens vote, in addition to issue and candidate identity. Davis and Olzik also have a nice discussion of ideology and different constituency issues. For instance, members of from farming states vote differently on bills than members of industrialized or commercial states. Ideology is a factor, conservative and liberal, but again, party is the most important determinant, and therefore it's the most reliable cue. So again, to finish this discussion of the internal operation of both chambers, in an era where members of both chambers, certainly the House, are less and less familiar with legislation because of its complexity or because of their specialization on their committee, the critical thing is how they vote. Then is how they take their cues, and and remember what a cue is a substitute for direct knowledge of the content of a bill, and so it turns out that the most reliable cue, of course, is party, but also individual, especially in the Senate, individual support of a particular senator, because of the collegial nature of the Senate, might be important. The region and the constituency pressures are also important. It determines the voting. But I think the most interesting discussion from that chapter is the nature of cues as a method of decision rather than direct knowledge of legislation. Whether that's good or bad, or for better or worse, or whether it's just a necessary concomitant of modern legislation, we can talk about that. You can think about that. but it certainly is descriptive of the way members of Congress embody their legislative functioning.